Turning your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. We want to finish this series we started. February is Black History Month. We're looking at how God worked with the nation of Israel in the Old Testament and the similarities that exist between the nation of Israel and their oppression, their struggle with slavery, and African Americans in this country, our own oppressions, struggles, and slavery. And I just believe that as the Lord blessed the nation of Israel, the Lord will also bless us as we move forward. Verse 6 says, "Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, deep springs, gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread would not be scarce, and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, when your herds and flocks grow large and your silver and gold increase and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land, with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and to test you so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant which he swore to your ancestors as it is to this day. Before you are seated, look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, don't forget where you come from. You may be seated. Don't be acting brand new because you got a little blessing. Father, we thank you now, and if you would please, that the words of my mouth and even the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight. You, O Lord, are my strength and my redeemer. All of God's people said, amen. So today we conclude this series, and what I have attempted to do is to give you some history that started from when we got here as a people back in the early 1600s all the way until the 1860s. My goal now is to take you from the 1860s to bring you all the way up until today. The Bible says that we have the responsibility of teaching our children and our children's children what the Lord has done. And unfortunately, we have not, as a people, done a good enough job of passing down our legacy and our history. We have left it up to the schools and the history books. We've left it up to the media to tell us what our history has been. And as a result, in many cases, we have been deprived and robbed of the rich culture that exists for African Americans that are here in this nation. As I said to you before, we got here because there was a three-way agreement between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The European nations, led by the Portuguese and the Dutch, then the British to come after, had manufactured goods that they wanted to trade. And so they went down to the western coast of Africa and exchanged those manufactured goods for slaves. understanding that in Africa there was already slavery prior to there being slavery here in America. So the goods were exchanged for the people. The people did not always want to go willingly. Some were forced and sold into slavery in exchange for these goods. They were put on ships, transported from West Africa to here, South America, and the Caribbean. That transport was called the Middle Passage, where some 9 million Africans were transported over the course of history. 2 million of them died on their way to getting here, many of them jumping off intentionally, saying that we would rather die than to stay in bondage. And when they got here, then those who were here, they were forced into hard labor because there was an abundance of crops here that they then took back to Europe. So Europe had the manufactured goods, Africa had the people, the Americas had the raw goods. There you had the three-way agreement that took place. We arrived here at Jamestown in the early 1600s. And ever since then, our plight here in America has been one of difficulty, strife. You can put that slide back on the screen. One of the most notable things that took place was the Civil War. Civil War started in 1861, went from 1865. The Civil War was the North and the South battling it out. The primary issue over the Civil War was slavery. By the way, I didn't tell you, but get your phones out so you can take pictures of these slides. So that when you get home, you can again revisit these slides because we have the responsibility of telling our children. So when you have your Sunday evening dinner tonight, as you're eating that chicken, get these slides out. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln put into law what we now know as the Emancipation Proclamation. It was this proclamation that technically, quote unquote, freed the slaves. We also know that December 31st, 1862, the day before this event took place, blacks gathered in churches and community squares and in homes praying that when the clock struck midnight, that not only would they see a new year, but that they would actually see freedom. This is why African Americans are the only ethnic group to do watch night services, because it's in commemoration of the fact that when the clock struck 12, January 1, 1863, we were officially free from slavery. But even though the Emancipation Proclamation took place, it still did not mean that the southern states wanted to let go of slavery easily. There was still very much strife and a wanting to hold on to the system because the system was extremely profitable for the southern states. In the South, including Virginia, you have tobacco, you have rice, and more importantly, you go right across the James River Bridge, you'll see an abundance of cotton. It was all of this that made the plantation owners very wealthy. And they were not about to give over their wealth easily just because President Lincoln decided to end slavery. So Congress had to step in. And when Congress stepped in, they passed 3 amendments to the Constitution, 3 that you need to know and you understand that have shaped and reshaped the course of black history here in our country. The first amendment that they passed was the 13th Amendment, which was in 1865. That amendment officially ended slavery in our country. It was after the North and South had battled it out. The North won. Congress steps in and now says slavery now is officially abolished in our country. Even then, the South still did not want to give it up easily. Don't you understand, when the enemy has his hands on you, he's not going to just let you go. And so Reconstruction starts. Reconstruction is the era where the government had to force the southern states to comply with the fact that slavery had ended. So in 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed. In 1868, the 14th Amendment is now passed. The 14th Amendment finally gives blacks equal protection under the law. See, prior to the 14th Amendment being passed, blacks were not viewed as full human beings. here in this country. We were considered to be 3/5 of a human and given 3/5 or not rights that everyone else was afforded. But it wasn't until the amendment was passed that for the first time in this country, even though we got here in the 1600s, some 200 and some years later after our arrival, blacks were now considered to be on equal footing with everybody else. 15th Amendment, which was then passed in 1870, is what finally allowed blacks, particularly men, the opportunity to vote. Now, women's rights still weren't there. Women weren't allowed to officially vote. The amendment for women to be able to vote did not come until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed. So these three amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to our Constitution, are the foundational amendments that have reshaped and changed and given us the opportunity to be liberated as we see today. 13th ended slavery, 14th equal protection under the law, and the 15th we're now exercising our right to vote. Now let me speed you up. Between 1877 and 1950, we then entered the era that we know as good old Jim Crow. Jim Crow was not a human being. He was a caricature of a black person acting foolishly. It's what whites used to mock and mimic blacks for certain behaviors. Whenever Jim Crow's name was mentioned, it was code for making sure that blacks were, quote unquote, kept in their place. So even though blacks were given freedom, and even though slavery was abolished under the 13th Amendment, Jim Crow now comes in and says, okay, you're free, but we're going to make it separate but equal. And there was nothing equal about it. And so what you now see is Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision in 1896, which said for a fact that blacks and whites could be separated but still be equal. So even though we had freedom, there was still great segregation that took place. And all of this took place between the late 1800s until we get to the middle 1900s, 1950s and 60s. What you also know is that in 1954, segregation became illegal in public schools. That was the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. What we also know is that in 1954, there was what was called the Little Rock Nine. Don't know if any of you know the story. There were 9 high school black kids in Little Rock, Arkansas, who tried to go into the high school, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1954, and was denied entry and was taunted and was not allowed to go in, even though they had just made so it would be possible for the black kids to go to the high school. It wasn't until they had to bring in the National Guard and other officials to come in that allowed the kids to be able to go to school, even though the laws had passed that said that segregation was illegal. Just because you're free don't mean that the enemy still don't want you. What we also see is that in 1955, 1 year later, a 42-year-old woman was getting on the bus in Alabama. She had had a long day. And at that time, segregate but equal, separate but equal was still applying even on the buses. Blacks couldn't ride in the front of the bus. They could only ride in the back. And there was a law that if the bus was full and there was a white that got on the bus, then any black that was up front had to get up from their seat while the white person sat. And there it was that day after a long day. 42-year-old Rosa Parks was sitting on the bus in her seat. White person enters the bus wanting to get her seat. She refused. As a result of that, she was arrested. And we know that the rest is history. The Montgomery bus boycott then followed. And let me help y'all understand the Montgomery bus boycott. Blacks decided that they would not ride the bus for 381 days. Now let's do some math. There's only 365 days in a year, which means that blacks decided we would rather walk, if it meant walking for a year, than to give our money over to people that don't support what we believe in. And if you don't learn anything else, that's the lesson that we ought to apply today. Why are we giving money to people that have no concern and value for our well-being? And nothing's going to change if we keep giving them our money. And what they decided to do is this: we'd rather pool our money, we'd rather carpool, we'd rather walk, we'd rather not give them anything. And the reason why the bus boycott ended was because the city lost so much money because black people withheld their money that they finally said, we're going to change the system. Not because of your skin tone, but because of the fact of your economic power that too many times in our community we don't even understand. And that's why when you go to the mall, what they want is for you to go in the air. If you go to the mall now, you notice every mall got 8 or 9 sneaker stores. Or urban stores. Because they understand if we ever decided to pool our money for things that matter the most, for housing and for welfare and to take care of our children and our family, we would be a dangerous people. So in 1957, the Civil Rights Act was founded. President Eisenhower then decided that there could be federal prosecution now for any person who tried to deny another person the right to vote. So even though the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote, men, and even though in 1920 the 19th Amendment allowed women to vote, what whites started to do is to give us poll taxes, literacy tests. They had to comprehend certain parts of the Constitution that no other person had to do, and they were denied the right to vote because of all of these other bogus tests and things to try to keep blacks from going to the polls. In 1957, Eisenhower said enough, but even in this, things were still going on. 6 years later, 1963, 200,000 people traveled to Washington, D.C., on the Washington Mall. And there, in the midst of that assembly, was a young preacher from Alabama, Dr. Martin Luther King. Atlanta and Alabama. He gave the famous I Have a Dream speech. And it was from that speech that the heightened civil rights era of the 60s really began to kick into full swing. 1 year later, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which gave equal employment and access to public facilities for the first time in our country. No longer could there be black and white bathrooms. No longer could there be black and white water fountains. For the first time, blacks and whites could share, or was to share, the same things. By the way, we got any people here who lived through the 60s? Raise your hand, please. Let me see. So y'all know what's going on because y'all lived it. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act took place, and the Voting Rights Act banned literacy tests for blacks, or for all rather, and it also started the process of eliminating poll taxes so that we could go to the polls and be able to vote without any tests or any prerequisite, just like any other citizen. That wasn't that long ago, 1965. And isn't it a shame that now that we have the right to vote freely, we still don't vote? Also in 1965, Malcolm X was killed. In the last piece of legislation in the civil rights era in the 60s was in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, which said that no longer could you discriminate housing based on race. Now we all had equal opportunity for housing. But it was in that same year of 1968, March, in Memphis, Tennessee, that the dreamer, Martin Luther King, was assassinated. If you were to look at the history of our country, of us, you would describe it as triumph and struggle. victories over oppression. Always the battle of having to fight for what's next, but making progress nonetheless. Now, the question that we must ask ourselves is this at this point, and it's a question that requires reflective honesty. Never have I read during the times of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, never did I read where black people shot and killed each other more than they do now. So somebody got to help me understand. How is it that now, when we have more access to things than we ever had, how is it now that we have more access to money as blacks than ever before in this country? How is it now that we have more educated blacks in this country than ever before? How is it now when we finally have the very things that our ancestors prayed for and never believed that they could see in their lifetime, but believe that their ancestors, their children's children will be able to see it? How is it that now that we have the things that they're praying for, that now we shoot and kill each other? Because they never did it during slavery. They never killed each other during Jim Crow. It wasn't even a thought of shooting and killing each other. And now we take out lives without even blinking an eye. Just this past week, Lassiter Drive, 23-year-old shot and killed. Not too far from here, this week, 17-year-old shot. What has happened in our communities where now we have turned on each other? This is the last slide I want to give, and then I'm going to the text. What I submit to you is what I believe is a perfect storm of how everything came together to where we now turned on ourselves. The first reason is crack. Crack originated in the late 70s and proliferated in the 80s. Powder cocaine was in great abundance, so much so that the dealers in our country couldn't get rid of it fast enough, which drove the prices of cocaine down. What the dealers decided to do to stay in the business is to create a more addictive and more profitable variant of powder cocaine. Made it in rocks, sold it in rocks. And that crack cocaine, which can addict you instantly off of one try, was introduced in our inner city communities. And by the way, if you do the research, it is believed, and there's a conspiracy, that the CIA is who planted it in our communities. You have a highly addictive drug with no opportunities for there to be any rehabilitation in that immediate vicinity. Whenever you are interacting with a highly addictive drug, then you understand and know that people would do just about anything to get another hit. After crack cocaine, then you had the government, which decided, well, we got to do something about these drugs. And if you remember in the 80s and 90s, there was the Just Say No campaign. And what the Just Say No campaign was trying to do, had intentions, but it heightened in 1990s under President Clinton, was that they started locking up people without question, mandatory minimums, no possibility for parole, none of that. And the main people who were getting hit were black men. Now keep in mind that the sentencing for crack was twice as hard as the sentencing for powder cocaine. And the reality is that we know why. Primarily blacks consume crack, primarily whites consume powder. When they came into our communities to take crack, and the dealers of the crack They were immediately sentenced to 10, 15 years, even though many of them were nonviolent offenders. But you understand what took place. As a result of that, black males, fathers, role models, coaches were systematically being removed from our communities. To where now, when you look in our community, 7 out of every 10 black children lives in a single-parent home. When the head is removed, it makes it harder on the body. And even when black men came from prison, many of them had felonies on their record, and you know as well as I do, a black man with a felony has a very difficult chance of getting employment. If he can't find a job and he's trying to take care of his family and nobody will hire, he's going to go back to doing what he was doing before, trying to feed his family. And as a result, more sentencing and more punishment. In every state in America, black males are the highest ethnic group of any person in the country. Even the whitest states in America, the populations in prisons are black men. When you couple that with an addictive substance, it leads for disaster. But it didn't end there. Lack of economic opportunities within our own communities. So because there were lack of right jobs, and you know as well as I do, black people got to do twice as much on their job just to be considered equal. And so because there are limited opportunities, economically speaking, because we didn't pool our monies, because we didn't invest in our own, because we didn't take care of our own, we left it in the hands of others. That left us without opportunities. And when you have people who don't have opportunities, who live in places where addiction is high, and you have the penal system removing men at an alarming rate, you have a very vulnerable family. But it didn't stop there either. Because once all that took place, then the guns slid into our communities. And if those four weren't bad enough, what I believe is the biggest thing that happened to our black community is not the crack. It's not the penal system. It is not lack of economic opportunities or guns. The biggest thing that happened to the black community after we got integration is we walked away from God. I'm in the text. Deuteronomy chapter 8. What Moses is attempting to do is to communicate with the nation of Israel, because the promised land is right on the other side of the river. He has given them instructions on what to do before you enter into the promised land, so that you don't act brand new once you get your blessings. In verse number 6, Moses gives the nation of Israel 3 primary instructions. Number 1, you are to observe the commands of the Lord. Know them, study them, and live them. Because it is not going to be up to you that's going to get you into this promised land. It is up to me. And as long as you observe what I have commanded you to do, then you're going to be fine. The second thing you need to do is walk in obedience. In other words, understand that there is a path that God has already laid out for you. And He wants you to walk in that path. Don't veer to the left. Don't veer to the right, because what I have for you is greater than what I'm giving to any other ethnic group, but you won't get it if you don't walk in obedience. And the last thing that I need you to do in verse number 6 is that I need you to reverence me. Reverence means that there is an awe and there is a wonder. There is something special when we enter into the presence of God. And perhaps one of the biggest things that's happening in our community today is that we have lost the reverence for God. We come in church any kind of way, and we don't give God any kind of reverence and respect. Do you understand that when you walk into a courtroom of law in our country, when the judge enters into the chamber, everybody got to stand? Whether you like it or not, you are told to stand, and there are repercussions when you don't stand when the judge enters the room. And that got me thinking, if we're going to stand for a man, or if we're going to stand for a woman, then what should we do when the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords enters into the place? We ought to shout. We ought to give God glory. We ought to be in awe. We ought to reverence his name. Why? Because the King of glory shall come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty. The Lord mighty in battle. And what we have done is that we have lost the reverence of God. There is no awe anymore. There is no wonder when we think about God. There's no beholding of the great things that he has done. We don't sit at times and just shake our head like the ancestors used to do over the amazement of what God has done. Now we come in and we sit down and we expect God to do everything that we prayed about. And then we got the audacity to get mad when he don't give us what we asked for. The devil is a liar. Who woke you up this morning? Who started you on your way? Who keeps your mind regulated? Who gave you the job that you didn't deserve? Who gave you the house that you shouldn't even be in? We ought to be in awe of what God. And this is the instructions that he gave to Moses to give to the nation. Observe his commands, walk in obedience, and have reverence for who he is. When you look in the New Testament, every time that the disciples saw Jesus in his full glory, the first thing that they did was they would bow down. When you look in Revelation, when you see the people dressed in white, when they got into the presence of God, one of the things that they did was they bowed down. And now when we come into church and we have worship to start the service, most of y'all sitting twiddling your thumbs. Most of y'all waiting for the moment to be over. Most of y'all wondering how long is it going to take. But when you call on God, you want him to move immediately. You want him to bless you right away. You got to come in here like this. I will enter into his gates with thanksgiving. I will enter into his courts with praise. Be thankful unto him and bless his name. For the Lord is... We walked away from God. We don't even reverence him like we used to. Even the Lord's Prayer talks about reverencing God in his name. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Reverence his name. Don't even call his name off your tongue flippantly and just for any other reason. But when you call on him, it ought to mean something when you call. So here's what he says. He says, if you observe my commands, if you walk in obedience, if you reverence me. Look at verses 7 through 9. Then he says, you're going to be able to go in and get the good part of the land. You're going to be able to go in and verse 9 says that you will never have scarcity of bread, that you'll be able to eat and be filled. You'll be able to have your needs met. That when you dig out in the fields, it's going to turn into copper. Blessings are going to come your way. And I believe there's some people in here that can look back and say, I might not have everything that I want. But when I go home today, there's going to be some food on the table. There's going to be some clothes in my closet. And it's because of the Lord taking care of me. Now, if you're glad that you ain't got everything, but you got enough to give God praise, can I get some folk right now to want to get up out of your seat and show some reverence for the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords? Thank you for what I got. Thank you for what you've given me. I know it's because of you, God. We got to get back to that. Observing his commands, walking in obedience, and reverencing him. He says, if you do that, I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you got enough to eat. I'll make sure that when you dig, you got blessings you didn't even ask for. I'll make sure I take care of all of that. That's in verses 6 through 9, but then it gets even better. In verse number 10, he says, I need you to do something for me. He says, when you get there and you bless him, and you sit down and eat, and are satisfied with what you ate, the one thing I need you to do is not call your girl or your boy. The one thing I need you to do is to give me praise that I allowed you to get into the place where I said you was going to go. You see, what we've also missed in this time, what the ancestors realized was that they might not have known how to read the Bible, but they knew how to praise God. They knew how to give him glory even in hard times. And I dare somebody in here right now that's going through a difficult time, I dare you to give God praise right now in the midst of it, to tell the devil, you meant it for my bad, but God meant it for my good. Can somebody give him praise right now for the things that God has blessed you with? Because when I give you what you asked for, I need you to give me praise. Now here is the warning. Be seated. I got a little bit more. Here's the warning in verse number 11. He says, now listen. After I give you what I said I was going to give you, and after I ask you to praise me, here's the request that I have of you. Don't you forget. Don't you forget my laws, my decrees, and my commands. Why? Because it was my laws, decrees, and commands is what got you out of Egypt, which is your slavery. Now, let me pause for a moment and say this. It's interesting to me as human beings and as a collective group, when we really need something from the Lord, we know how to approach God. We wake up with it, and when we really need something, we get out of bed early, get down on our knees. Father, I thank you, but I really need you to bless me today. Before we go to sleep at night, if it's still on our mind, we'll get down on our knees one more time. God, I need you to bless me and bless my family. It's amazing to me that when we really need something, when we're in a tight squeeze, when we're between a rock and a hard place, we know where to go. And we know who to talk to in order to get a prayer through. But once we get what we ask for, once God gives it to us, it's amazing how you don't have that same zeal to get up in the morning. It's amazing you don't have that same burn to pray before you go to sleep. It's amazing that once you get what you ask for, that all of a sudden now the fervor of your prayer, the fervor of your praise, the fervor of you coming to church ain't as strong as it used to be. Fast forward now. Our ancestors knew how to pray because they hadn't tasted freedom yet. They knew how to pray because they hadn't gotten voting rights yet. They knew how to pray because they was getting whipped and dealing with Jim Crow and getting churches burned and getting houses burned and getting discriminated against. And once we got past that, now we come in here and you want to pray for Jordans. You want to pray for a new car. When our ancestors didn't even have a car. You want to pray for more clothes. When our ancestors only had one pair of shoes. And then we got the audacity to get mad when God don't give us what we ask for. We are walking in verse number 11. Have we forgotten what the Lord has brought us from? Have we forgotten that it was not that long ago that our ancestors was breaking their backs in the fields picking cotton? Have we forgotten that it was not that long ago where the slave owner was taking our women behind the shed? Have we forgotten that we used to get beaten and whips all on the back of us? Have we forgotten? And the Lord delivered us from all of that. And now that we got freedom, we have forgotten what the Lord has done. We have forgotten about how far he has brought us as a people. We have forgotten of the great things. Why? Because a black man got in the White House? Because now you got a job that you like. Because you're driving the car that you want. What happened to the fervor of your prayer? He said, be careful that you do not forget. He said, because this is what's going to happen. Verses 12 and 13. When you start getting the stuff you want, the fields are growing like you want, the money's flowing like you want, the clothes is right like you want, you're driving what you want, living where you want, working where you want, your boo acting right. He said, when all that happens, verse 14, then your heart's going to become proud. And you will forget what I have done for you. Family, our hearts got proud. And we forgot where we came from. We ain't never had no silver spoon in this country. Ain't nothing been given to us. Why are you acting like now? We've always had to work hard for what we got. Why you think now somebody gonna give it to you? You always had to be more educated and have yourself together. We've always had to work in two worlds, to speak the master's English in one group and speak hood in the other. Why all of a sudden now do you expect things to be different? We've always had to know how to take care and raise our children to be respectful. Why has it changed now? And for everybody that wants to do this, because you done went to see Wakanda. Let me tell you, I just got back from Ethiopia and Kenya, and I see how the parents raise their kids. They ain't got a whole lot of stuff, but what they do teach their kids is you're going to be respectful. You're going to speak when you're spoken to. You're going to learn how to keep your mouth shut. You're going to say yes, sir, and no, sir. So if you're going to do this, and all you got your African garb on and your kids running like crazy. You ain't even seen Africa. You ain't been to Africa. What has happened to us? We walked away from God. God said, don't do it, because if you do, your heart's going to become proud. But I want to leave you with this. Verse 17, Moses tells the people, I want to remind you of something when it comes to wealth. Because you believe, much like us today, that the wealth that you now have, or for Moses, what you're about to get, the wealth that you got is because of your hands. Because you worked hard. And as a result of you working hard, now you got wealth. Well, if you believe that simply because you work hard, that you are deserving of wealth, then how come people in Africa who work harder than you ain't got wealth? So then it cannot simply be, come on out, praise team, that it's because of your hands that allowed you to accumulate wealth. Verse 18 is clear. He says, I want you to know, nation of Israel, and I want you to know, Black America, that if there's going to be any wealth, it is not simply to be with our hands. That the wealth that we accumulate, verse 18, is because it is God who gives you the ability to earn a living. Because you say it's your education, and you say it's your skill set. But I say your intellect don't matter if you ain't got good health and you lying on your back. You say it's your years of experience. I say it's God that keeps your heart beating. And if your heart ain't beating, it don't matter what kind of years of experience you got. Somewhere along the line, we have lost the fact that wealth is not a direct proportion of our own hands. Wealth is the result of God's hand on me. And because his hand is on me, then I can work my hands. So let's stop telling these children half-truths, that it is not simply just going to school and working hard. It is going to school and working hard, but trusting in God. Because there's some people in here that went to school and worked hard and still got laid off. Went to school and worked hard and still got fired. And if it had not been for the Lord, when you had bills that had to be paid, and you didn't know how you were going to get them paid, but somehow, some way, you got everything taken care of, it had to have been. So don't forget where you come from. It's the Lord's doing that has brought us this far. And it's the Lord's doing that will keep us on. I need everybody stand.